Just a little intro to me for those of you who accidentally joined or do not know me. I was adopted from South Korea at 3 months old, so I was raised by a very loving, very white family in South Lake, Texas. So I did not consider myself Asian American until I went to college. More specifically, when I joined the Asian student organization, the Asian Cultural Exchange at DePaul University, through which I eventually became president. And one of the most formative experiences that I had was DePaul, when I was there, was piloting a new Asian American Studies minor. I was a communications major and a poli-sci minor at the time. I was planning to go to law school or do broadcast journalism, but I took an Asian American Studies 101 class to help them with enrollment. Ethnic studies folks know it's really hard to get those classes filled up. So I took an Asian American Studies class and learned a lot of the topics that we're going to cover tonight, and it changed the course of my life. So I ended up minoring in Asian American Studies, and then when I learned all of the intersectionalities, I also double minored in women's and gender studies. And so that really was the catalyst for a lot of my work, and especially my desire to create something like this in Dallas. So that brings us here today. So just to start, we're gonna cover a lot of history. It's not necessarily chronological because so much was happening at the same time, kind of in different communities, but I think we are all very aware of some of the recent movements that one of which sparked our organization's founding and the increase in reports of anti-Asian hate crimes and the Stop AAPI movement, and also our solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and ongoing movements. But all of this dates back to the earliest periods that we were here. And I know deportation, immigration is a big topic right now, and we, Asian Americans, were the reason that exclusionary immigration policies were even created. So the first policy that targeted people by nationality, we think of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, but it was actually predated by the Page Act of 1875, which targeted primarily Asian women because they argued that women that were trying to immigrate from China and Japan, etc., were being brought here for lewd or immoral purposes like prostitution. So that was really the beginning. So again, the intersectionality of gender and race is really significant in our history. But the Chinese Exclusion Act started in 1882. The first wave of Chinese immigrants came for the gold rush, the dream of striking it rich, which unfortunately didn't happen for most immigrants. And then I'm gonna go through a speedy history lesson so we can get to the art part, but a lot of the Chinese immigrants then went into the railroad labor force, and that caused a bit of competition from white laborers. And so there was a move to exclude Chinese immigrants from belonging, leading to the Chinese Exclusion Act. So when we think about art and American history, I think one of the first things we probably learn in history in our textbooks is the Statue of Liberty and Emma Lazarus's poem, and give me your tired and poor, your huddled masses, etc. I probably misquoted that, but we think of Ellis Island and America as being this welcoming place for immigrants, and the melting pot or the salad. And how many of us learned about Ellis Island in high school or elementary school? Yeah. How many of us learned about Angel Island? Not as many hands. All right, so Angel Island was marketed as the Ellis Island of the West Coast. So it was built in San Francisco Bay in 1910. And they talked about it, being like Ellis Island, but with sea breezes and palm trees. This is Angel Island Immigration Station. So that's a photo from the National Archives. So Ellis Island welcomed, millions of immigrants. Only about 2% of them were detained. And when they were detained, it was, a couple hours. They just had to go through some paperwork, some questions. About 500,000 immigrants went through Angel Island Immigration Station from multiple different countries, but most especially because of the Exclusion Act were Chinese. Almost 100% of them were detained. And it wasn't for hours, it was for days, weeks, even up to 2 years. So they were asked, very difficult questions, complicated questions about their families. There were language barriers, and they were also scrutinized heavily by medical officers. So again, sort of things that we've seen in recent years, Chinese or Asian people being associated with potential disease, and so they were faced grueling strip searches and medical inspections, and they were, again, detained for months, weeks, years. While the immigrants were detained in Angel Island, they started carving poetry onto the walls of barracks. So the walls were wooden. And so they were carving poetry about their experiences, talking about missing home. I'm actually going to pass around this book because it has translations of the poetry that was found. And what's interesting, so Angel Island closed in 1940, and it went abandoned for several years, and it was scheduled for demolition. And a park ranger went and explored and just wanted to see what it looked like before it was demolished, went inside and found all of the carvings on the walls and brought in scholars and people to help translate, and they realized what it was. And the community really galvanized, advocated for it to be preserved because this was such an important part of our history. And so it ended up being granted historic status, and it's being restored so that this poetry can be seen today. And the really unfortunate part is that the women's quarters were destroyed in a fire. So it's one of the early examples of the stories of Asian American women's voices being silenced or their stories not being documented. But we can assume that if they went through some of the similar things, that their poetry might have elaborated. And there actually is a book that reimagined what some of the women's poetry might have been like. But this was really significant because it documented the immigrant experience, and it was a counter narrative to the propaganda that was going around about this being just like Ellis Island. It really highlighted what discriminatory racist treatment Asians faced compared to what was happening at Ellis Island. So again, there were many people that came through, but most were Chinese. So those were some images of the medical inspections that were happening, the health inspectors. We'll skip around a little bit. So this was the first example of Asian American art documenting something that was happening in incarceration, counter to what the government or dominant culture was trying to say. So I said we were going to skip around. I'm trying to connect things by theme instead of chronological order. So speaking of incarceration and containment, Japanese incarceration. This was something that we did. Most of us learned about Japanese incarceration, right? Or at the time it was internment, but AAPI language tells us that it's incarceration now. And so we think about Japanese incarceration, and we've seen, photos from like Dorothea Lange from the AP and how it was documented, etc. But some of the most important documentation of Japanese incarceration actually came from the inside. So, did anyone learn about Toyo Miyatake in school? Okay, so Toyo Miyatake was born in Japan in 1895. His family immigrated to LA, and he was raised in Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. He was a photographer. He opened a portrait studio, so he was kind of known for doing like these, traditional family portraits or when someone graduated, etc. And he was well renowned for his talent. He was part of a group of photographers called the LA Camera Pictorialist Group, and some of the other photographers in that were Edward Weston, Ansel Adams. If anyone saw my Instagram story, I was asking, so Edward Weston is one of my favorite photographers. This is my favorite photo probably ever. So remember that connection for a little bit later. Unfortunately, Toyo Miyatake's family was forcibly removed and incarcerated after Executive Order 9066 and the bombings of Pearl Harbor. And they were sent to Manzanar War Relocation Center. Now, incarcerees were banned from bringing recording or photographic equipment, cameras, with them. But Toyo knew that this needed to be documented, so he brought pieces of camera equipment, like a lens, a film holder, etc., and smuggled it into the camp. And while he was in the camp, built a camera with pieces of wood and the equipment that he had smuggled in. And he started going out, early morning or when the guards weren't watching, and secretly documenting life inside the camps to great risk to himself and his family. And what was sort of the turning point for this was that his friends, Edward Weston, for example, on the outside, helped get equipment to him, so they would sneak it in and hide film in the pockets of a guard's jacket for him, and eventually they convinced the camp director, Ralph Merritt, to let Toyo be the camp's official photographer. And the rule was that Toyo was not actually allowed to take the photo, so he would have to set it up and then have somebody supervising that would hit the shutter. So that was how he kind of got around doing that. But his photos were so powerful because he was able to get angles from that would never have been seen otherwise, and it was a chance to not only document the atrocities and the pain, but also to humanize all of the people that were incarcerated. And so he took photos that showed life inside, but he also took portraits of families and continued giving people the validation and the affirmation that a photographer would give outside of incarceration. And so Toyo's work is a really, really good example of the asserting agency and humanity in a setting that was really intended to strip them of both of those things. So all of that was through art, and I'll pass another book around. So there's this book is called Displaced. So Manzanar, it's photos of several of the photographers that document it, but Toyo's are in there. Another important, I think, example of how art humanized and documented the experience from the voice of the community themselves was at Crystal City. So Crystal City was one of the incarceration sites, and it's in Texas. So does everyone here know all the different incarceration sites that are in our state? We even have one in Seagoville, which is about 20-25 miles east of here. But Crystal City was considered, they said, one of the nicer camps because families were allowed to live together there. And communities, really robust communities were developed. They actually had schools, they had baseball teams, etc. And they documented this in a newspaper that they created called the Crystal City Times. So there was an official paper documenting the goings-on, a lot of kind of just rough illustrations, cartoons, because again, photography was banned in most places, and so illustrations became a really important art form to show what was happening. You can even see news about the senior prom, and so trying to humanize again and really reaffirm that the incarcerees deserve to have full lives and experiences during their incarceration. And all of these, so the CSU Department of Archives and Special Collections in California has them, but Crystal City Times, there's also some in UTSA's special collections. So if you're ever at the Texas Institute of Cultures, I think it's called, you can go and see some photocopies of these. So this is I'm sorry, there's not a really good transition for some of these. We're jumping a little bit of ahead now. So while Japanese were being incarcerated, Chinese were still excluded at this time, Filipinos had a very different experience because the US had been fighting a war and colonized the Philippines. And as a result of that, Filipino laborers were able to come to the United States and get work, but they were exploited very, very heavily. So in 1965 and 1970, several Filipino workers were working in the grape fields for some of the wineries, etc. And they were working in really terrible conditions for low pay, and they decided to organize. So they formed the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, and this was led by people like Larry Idleong, Philip Veracruz, Pete Velasco, so some of the really well-known Filipino labor organizers. And they decided in 1965 to walk off the fields and demand higher wages, better conditions, and go on strike. And so they did that, but what happened was, and what has happened historically, is when one group of laborers goes on strike, they're pitted against other communities and other marginalized laborers. So for example, the Mexican workers then would come in and take over some of the work, and then it would just kind of go back and forth, because when one would strike, the other would take over, and nobody was getting anywhere. So the Filipino labor organizers reached out to the National Farm Workers Association, the NFWA, which was led by Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, in 1966 after that first strike. And they decided to merge. So they formed the United Farm Workers, and they organized nationwide boycotts of grapes. And so there's examples of different artwork. They did a lot of protest demonstrations. This is an example of the, it's going so fast, the logo, but with Filipino, designed by the Filipino community. So by 1970, most of the growers were able to sign union contracts, which granted them better wages and protection. So all of that happened because of the solidarity between those two groups. And when we think about the labor movement, a lot of times we do know Cesar Chavez, but we don't necessarily learn about Larry Idleong, and he's the one that started the strike itself. Something that the Filipino workers and Chinese laborers had in common were they were primarily men at the time, because again, women were barred or seen as prostitutes, diseased, etc. And what that did, there's somebody that had referred to it as social castration, which is sort of the phenomenon that happened. The men weren't allowed to marry white women or outside their race. They weren't allowed to bring their wives or families from home, and so they developed these bachelor communities. They weren't able to raise families, and they became each other's families. And so as these farm workers in the Filipino community aged, again, they were making very low wages for several years, and now not working. They're living off of Social Security, a fixed income, and it was hard for them to find affordable housing. And so the International Hotel was built. It was located in San Francisco's Manila town, which was on the edge of Chinatown. And it was built in 1907 for seasonal Filipino farm workers who were making low-income wages, and it became a really vital community center. It was where a lot of the Filipino laborers retired and lived in their elderly years. It was about $50 a month for rent, so it was very affordable. But unfortunately, in the 1960s, the corporate developers targeted Manila town as a place that they wanted to essentially destroy so that they could build hotels, corporate development, etc. And they slated the Hotel, the International Hotel, for demolition so it could be turned into a parking lot. And so 1968, the owners and developers, backed by the city, issued eviction notices. $50 a month. There was no way in San Francisco that these elderly Filipino men would be able to find places to live, and so tenants, student activists, artists, community organizers rallied to protect not only Manila Town, but specifically the International Hotel, because it became really a symbol of Manila Town. And some of the organizations that were involved in that work, one we're going to talk about a little later, the Asian American Political Alliance, and the Kearny Street Workshop, which was an artist collective. And so they did murals, protest posters, poetry readings, performances to help spread the message. So this poster is pretty iconic. And at the very, very bottom, you can see like, join the phone tree, call such and such. So really this grassroots movement, but all of it centered around art. So unfortunately, even though they got a lot of attention and support, they decided to go ahead with demolition, and labor organizers got wind of a potential police raid that was going to happen in the middle of the night. And because they had been doing so much organizing, they were actually able to, you can see the poster behind there, the police came, they were able to gather a group of allies in solidarity who blocked the entrance to the International Hotel where the elderly residents were living, and try to protect people from being dragged out. Unfortunately, that did not stop the police. They came on horses, they had axes, they went and forced their way, dragged organizers out. The organizers were really worried about the safety of the elders, and so they decided to call off. Each elder was escorted out with one of the activists. So there's really powerful photos of just the care that the community was showing during that time. But unfortunately, as I said, the demolition went through, and the building was completely demolished. However, this has a semi-happy ending because organizers continued to fight for Manila Town, and they actually were able to open a new hotel in the same location in 2005. Unfortunately, the original residents weren't still around to move back into their home. So the solidarity that happened during the iHotel protests were made possible because of a movement that was happening at the campuses nearby. And so we talked about the Third World Liberation Front strikes before we started, but this was kind of the birthplace of the Asian American political identity. So between 1968 and 1969, San Francisco State College started the strikes for ethnic studies, followed by UC Berkeley, which started in 1969. And so it was a coalition of student groups, Black Student Union, the Asian American Political Alliance, Latinx organizers, et cetera, all fighting for the creation of ethnic studies at their schools and open admissions for minority students. It was the largest and longest student strike in US history. And it deserves its own full lecture. So unfortunately, we don't have time to go into all of it. But what I wanted to highlight was simultaneously, while all of this was going on at the campuses, San Francisco, Berkeley, at UCLA, a group of students started Gidra magazine. So they founded this in 1969, like around the same time as the Third World Liberation Front strikes. And it became known as the voice of the Asian American movement. So Gidra was named after a three-headed dragon monster from a Japanese film, and it symbolized the multifaceted resistance. So you can see some of the covers. It was a creative tool that they used both for an outlet for artists, but also a political tool for mobilizing, educating the communities, a lot of hand-drawn illustrations, radical posters, and a lot of experimental graphic design. It was started by a group of activists, so they weren't necessarily people who considered themselves artists or writers. It was more, how can we get this message out and educate readers about things like US imperialism in Asia and discrimination that was happening locally, and really connecting the global and national struggles together. So they talked about topics like police brutality, housing discrimination, and what was really significant about this was self-representation. So stories about our communities by our communities. They didn't make any money. They said that they said that they were going to charge like 25% per magazine, but they ended up giving them away or bringing big piles to community events, etc. And it was a blueprint for movement building even today. Something that, thinking about all of the social media tools that we use now and how censored and heavily controlled they are, you might think about going back to something like this. Okay, so I will say that the Asian American identity and that term has a lot of historic significance, and it's a big reason why we chose that even in our name, the Dallas Asian American Historical Society, as a nod to those Berkeley activists who started it. And it's also to respect Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders' right to self-determination and telling their own stories. But we wanted to make sure, especially because we're going into AAPI month, and the title of this talk is AAPI Solidarity, that we incorporated stories as well. And so I wanted to talk about a very historic movement, and that was the Kaho'olawe, the smallest of Hawaii's main islands. And it was designated as a US Navy bombing range in 1941 after Pearl Harbor. So the US Navy took over, declared martial law, took over the island and used it as a bombing range. So they tested out bombs both for World War II, Korean War, for the American War in Vietnam, and the tests that they detonated, massive explosives, created craters on the island, and no Native Hawaiians were allowed access to it. So in 1976, activists formed an organization to protect the island and to stop the military exercises. So the Kaho'olawe, it was the Protect Kaho'olawe Ohana, the PKO, and one of the main activists that was involved was George Helm. So George Helm was a renowned musician, and he used his music to connect more people to the cause. So a lot of people saw this movement as something really political, but the songs that he performed and sang reminded people of the spiritual connection and responsibility to protect the land, and it galvanized a lot of support. So I just wanted to, I just want to play one of his songs so that you can hear his voice is beautiful. So he was, his nickname was that people called him like frog voice for his singing voice, until a music teacher realized that he could sing this really beautiful falsetto. And so once he kind of learned his ideal range, you'll hear. Falsetto. So he used to perform in nightclubs around Hawaii and then at the protests. So George and 8 other activists decided to raise awareness by actually going to the island against the rules, and so they were the Kaho'olawe 9. They landed in January 1976, and it brought national attention because they had staked their claim, and they kept getting kicked out, and then they would come back. And there was one time where 2 of them were left behind and were in hiding on the island. And so they decided to go back and look for them eventually, not realizing that the Navy had actually already picked them up and were detaining them. During that time, they got stuck on the island, and so George and another activist tried to, they all tried to go back to Maui on surfboards. One of the activists decided to go back to the island. George had a head injury, and so they were going to try to keep going. They actually were never found again. They found the surfboards. So George and the other man passed away, but because he had created this beautiful music, his message and the movement continued after his death, and people really credit his artistry to capturing this spirit of the movement that garnered so much support. We're running low on time, but I do want to share one more story of a Hawaiian poet from contemporary times. She is the Hawaii State Poet Laureate from 2023 to 2025, and an associate professor at the University of Hawaii, specializing in Indigenous studies. So Brandy Nilani McDougall wrote a poem called Resist, and she was inspired by a Palestinian activist and poet. So I want to play a video of her reading this poem because it's very powerful.
Resist, my people, resist them. From a line by a poem by Doreen Chatur. Stand in range as the wind and current clash, rile lightning and thunder, fire surge and boulder crash. Let the ocean eat and scrape away these walls. Let the sand swallow their fences whole. Let this thick air between us split the atmosphere. Scream and shriek and cry and grieve if nothing else. We have no land, no country, but we still have these bodies, these stories, this language of rage. And this resistance is bitter, but it feels like medicine, like our lands and villages are planted and replanted there, where it's dark and warm. We unfurl our tangle of roots as we write our poems, blow salt across these blurred borders of memory. So they made themselves fences and bullets, checkpoints, gates, and guard posts. They made themselves hotels and mansions, adverse possession, martial law, and deeds. They made themselves shine through that plunder. They say we can never. They say we will never, because they, and the hills and mountains have been mined for rock walls, the reefs pillaged for coral floors. And they say we can never. We can never, because the deserts and dunes have blown away for more of their houses and highways. Because we can never. Because the forests have been razed and scorched, and we, the wards, refugees, houseless, the present absentees, the unrecognizable, the diasporic, uncivilized natives, activists, terrorists, resistors, our springs and streams are drying, so they say we can never return, but we make ourselves houses to hold all our dead, engrave their names in the clouds. We sing whole villages awake again. We crouch down to eat rocks like fruit, to hold the dirt, the sand in our hands, to fling words the way fat drops of rain splatter off tarp or corrugated roofs. We remember the sweetness and rise up through the plunder. They say we will never return, but they don't know they could never really make us leave.
So I think her poem is really a powerful example of, even as we're telling our own stories, there's so many connections that our communities face historically, and art reminds us of those commonalities, I think, in a way that other forms can't. This artist that I showed in the beginning, Amanda Pingbodi Pakia, she also created this mural which showcases the friendship between Yuri Kochiyama and Malcolm X. So if we had all the time in the world, I would talk a little bit more about our involvement in the civil rights movement and Yuri and Malcolm X's friendship. But the reason that I bring Yuri up is because I recently saw research that Stanford and UC Berkeley did. They used AI to scan 30 widely used high school textbooks from California and Texas, where Asian Americans, have a significant population, and they found only 1% of sentences referenced Asian Americans or Asians. Nearly half were tied to war or conflict, so verbs like attack, invade, threaten, and none of those textbooks included Yuri Kochiyama. So I wanted to conclude the lecture part of the event with one of my favorite quotes from Yuri that I think speaks to a lot of the themes throughout this and the solidarity, and that is, we are all part of one another. And I don't think there's anything that shows that more than art. And I'll say for myself, I introduce myself as like a historian or activist, and I forget that I'm an artist. So I'm a writer, I'm a photographer, a musician, dancer. Art literally saved my life in high school, but I forget that art is such a big part of my identity. And I think it's important for us to realize that art isn't necessarily having our work displayed on gallery walls. It's how we express the things that we care about and the things that we're passionate about. And so I invite us all to consider all of these different ways historically that we've contributed our creativity in service of solidarity.